Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, permit me to begin by just addressing a few of the points that were just raised in the contribution of the member for Sawa Barataria. Because what he has indicated to the population through you and in this chamber is completely contrary to the reality of what is taking place outside in Trinidad and Tobago. Saying that there is no panic in the country right now is completely false. Because on the way to Parliament, schools were being closed, parents were being called across the country and asked to come and collect their children. Groceries right now, there is unfortunately a lot of panic buying going on. So therefore, this is the reality and this is true, and I take ownership of it on the Parliament floor. So, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, we have come here and what we're being fed and what we're being given has become the modus operandi, of those on the other side in terms of governance. It is all about public relations, communications, and what we call smoke and mirrors. So just to tell, the member for Couva North will get her turn to speak if she is chosen to speak. So what we have come here today, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. So let us start, Mr. Speaker. Let us start with what a state of emergency requires. Because you see, as my friend from Barataria Sawa quite rightly said, it is to do with the Constitution, which is the supreme law of Trinidad and Tobago. And there are certain conditionalities that must exist in accordance with the Constitution for the calling and the extension of a state of emergency. Because first thing for the population to understand is that a state of emergency is the suspension of all citizens' constitutional rights. No doubt about that. Our entrenched rights under sections 4 and 5 are suspended under the state of emergency, and that is borne out in the regulations, the Emergency Power Regulations 2025, that have been amended a number of times, very quietly, by the government during this period of time. And it is important that we understand, just because, unlike previous states of emergency that have existed, the states of emergency that have been called in Trinidad and Tobago and that have suppressed our constitutional rights for 2025, 2 of them have not had curfews and have not restricted the movement of citizens. Because you see, these are the things traditionally, those measures that give citizens a feeling of encroachment on their rights. But it is important that citizens understand, and I will demonstrate clearly, that even the safeguards that have been put in place, as the member for Barataria Sawa referred to the tribunal under the regulations and Schedule 1, the schedule, to the regulations, that tribunal has been put in place. I will give live examples of what is going on. It was also curious because you see, in the calling of a state of emergency, and yes, it is part of history. At the end of last year, the previous government called a state of emergency, and the country began the first 3 months of the year in a state of emergency, and now we've just completed another 3 months of the year. So out of 10 months in the year, we've had 6 months of state of emergency. So crime statistics are, by definition, going to be lower. There is no denial of that. So the first question that is asked, despite the Honorable Attorney General's very careful language used, and he's repeated on a number of occasions, this is not the UNC's crime plan. All we have heard, including from the member for Barataria Sawa, is the use of statistics, crime statistics, and I will put on the record immediately that the members on this side are very happy when crime is down, and in particular, murders are down in Trinidad and Tobago. But what we will not participate in is an attempt to hoodwink the population. By definition, a state of emergency is going to lead to a reduction of crime. And in a short while, I'll refer to an article by an international body that has studied the effects of states of emergency in both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, and comes to some very interesting conclusions based on their analysis. The most important statistic I was waiting to hear from the member on the other side, the previous speaker, and any coming member who may speak after, because it has not been provided by the Attorney General nor by the member for Barataria Sawa, is okay, we know under state of emergency, and I'll come to it, you can arrest people without a warrant. And they've listed how many arrests. In fact, the member for Barataria Sawa said 3,209 arrests. Of course, we all know with an arrest, it is taking away your rights under state of emergency. But the most important statistic that we have not heard, that I was hoping to hear this evening, is how many charges of those arrested have been laid. Because a state of emergency, and especially the detention powers, and we've heard 100, if I remember correctly, 141 detention orders, 142 preventative detention orders were issued by the member for Tunapuna. It is easy to arrest, it is easy to detain, and the police have said to the country that they needed this initially, and we've heard it confirmed this afternoon by the government that the immediate initial threats have been dealt with. So to come and tell the country 3,000 arrests and not tell us out of the arrests how many charges have been laid. And more importantly, because the whole calling of the state of emergency initially was to deal with gangs, criminal activity, and we've heard it again confirmed this afternoon, in particular coming out of the prison system, how many charges have been laid, the country needs to know, under the state of emergency, under the anti-gang legislation. And that is the most important statistic. Of course, we're happy when guns are taken off the street, illegal firearms. We've said here repeatedly, the only purpose of a firearm is to harm someone. But you don't call a state of emergency to take guns off of the street, because what you're doing is suppressing, Mr. Speaker, your constitutional rights. And all 41 members in here, constitutional rights have been suspended. When you go to Section 8, Mr. Speaker, of the Constitution, and this is really for the population to know, because the framers of the Constitution were very careful. The use of a state of emergency is something of last resort. And don't compare it to legislation in Jamaica that has actually been held unconstitutional by the courts there, where they have specific zones that you can cordon off and suspend rights. And they're going through their court system now, where the courts, having already ruled it's unconstitutional. You don't rule it, because we as a government looked at it, and there were proposals people put forward, adopt similar legislation. And I was one of the people who objected to it, because I believe in constitutional rights and our enshrined rights, right of movement, the right to have bail applications. The law has now moved. The Privy Council, Mr. Speaker, would be very familiar with what the Privy Council has now ruled. Even in cases of murder, persons now have a right to apply for bail. That shows you and is a clear indication of how important that particular right is. And the population needs to know now that if they are detained under the existing state of emergency that we're being asked to extend, and we have not been provided with any level of detail as to why it should be extended, that your rights to bail are gone. When you are held under a detention order, you have no right to bail. And worse than that, you have no right to habeas corpus, Mr. Speaker. And there are people now who are languishing under that. Of course, if you've engaged in criminal activity and the police have held you under the state of an emergency because it has given them additional powers, then you should be prosecuted with the full amount of law. And I'm going to show how the tribunal process is failing. So the same safeguard that was referred to is almost non-existent. And the population needs to know, under the emergency power regulations, what can befall them and what has befallen some and how it is failing. Under Section 8 of the Constitution, you can only call a state of emergency if the president is satisfied and he or she, whoever is the president, really has no room to maneuver because it's based on Section 80 of the Constitution. Once the president is advised, he or she has to do it in this instance. But the framers of the Constitution have put very clearly what are the circumstances under which you can call a state of emergency. And we have heard none of them here today. It applies to an extension as well. It must, as Mr. Speaker knows. So the first is the president must be satisfied, of course, based on the advice of the government. A convenient point to say, if the law enforcement intelligence services give the government advice, it is up to the government to make the final decision. Because very often they do advise, call a state of emergency. And the first question National Security Council must ask, as we did, is, but why do you require this? Why must you suspend rights? Because under the books of law of Trinidad and Tobago, you have all of the law available at your fingertips. You can get search warrants. You can search premises. You can arrest. So how many charges under the anti-gang legislation have taken place out of those 3,200 people arrested? You can only call a state of emergency if there is a public emergency that has arisen as a result of the imminence of a state of war between Trinidad and Tobago and a foreign state. That is the first conditionality. And look how ironic where we find ourselves today. The second by the framers of the Constitution is that you can call a state of emergency, or it is actually called a period of public emergency, when you say that the public emergency has arisen as a result of the occurrence of any earthquake, hurricane, flood, fire, outbreak of pestilence, or of infectious disease or other calamity, whether similar to the foregoing or not. Reminder to the population, that is why we were in a state of emergency under COVID, when the virus was rampaging the world and killing people in the millions. The framers have been very careful as the circumstances under which we should be in a state of emergency, solely for the purpose that they recognize it is a suspension of our rights. A suspension of your right that you cannot get habeas corpus. Habeas corpus population through the Speaker means that if you are being detained by authorities and they're not giving you information, and someone wants their family member to know that they're okay, and they're meeting less than facilitative authorities, you can go to the court, the High Court of Trinidad and Tobago, because it must be a High Court judge, and make an application for the person being detained or arrested to be brought before the court, so that the court in its judgment can decide if you're being properly treated. You do not have that right under the current state of emergency. The police can turn up to your house, and worse yet, one of the points I have not heard, and it is very, very relevant right now, based on what is happening, despite government and UNC pages saying it's not happening, because the Defense Force has sent out a memo, and they have called for people to turn up at the bases. The emergency power regulations that govern the state of emergency, at regulation number 19, give the Defense Force all of the powers of the police service. That is another stretch of powers under the state of emergency. So the Defense Force officers and the police officers under these regulations, can stop any vehicle anywhere in Trinidad and Tobago and then take the people out, arrest them, and worse yet, we get to the detaining powers, which is where the real concern lies. And you can't go to court, you can't get habeas corpus, you can't get bail. The regulations allow, and when we drafted it, we were careful to keep it in conformity with the law, that if you're arrested, 48 hours the police service have to hold you without charging you. But after that 48 hours, under these state of emergency regulations, someone at the level of an assistant superintendent or a magistrate can grant permission to keep you arrested and detained for up to 7 days after the 48 hours. Your rights are suspended. Every single citizen's rights. I get back to the conditions for calling a state of emergency. So I came here this afternoon a little apprehensive because the first condition is if there's imminence of a state of war. Thankfully, we have not heard that from the government. The second is basically if there's natural disaster, including something like COVID. Well, we know it is not that. The third conditionality is that action has been taken or is immediately threatened by any person of such a nature and on so extensive a scale as to be likely to endanger the public safety or to deprive the community or any substantial portion of the community of supplies or services essential to life. It can only be under that express condition that an extension is being sought, that action has been taken or is immediately threatened by any person of such a nature and on so extensive a scale as to be likely to endanger the public safety or deprive the community or any substantial. First question, where is the immediacy? We came here on the last occasion in July, we were told, we took the government at its word, we took the Commissioner of Police at his word, there was an immediate threat that could disrupt public safety coming out of the prison system. We've seen what has happened, but all we have heard here today is a repetition of this statistic and that statistic, not a single charge, but yet you're asking the whole country to continue allowing their rights to be curtailed and suspended. Where is the immediate threat? To come here and to say, well, it is a continuation of operations, really? A continuation of operations that require that none of us, if we're held under a detention order, can get habeas corpus or bail? How many of those who have been held under detention orders have been charged? And the member for Barataria Sawa spoke about the safeguards of the tribunal process. Let me get to that, Mr. Speaker. Because the country needs to know if this process is working. Yes, the regulations set out a safeguard. And just for the country's edification, the person who issues a detention order, which means that any citizen can be held and detained, and not detained in prison, detained in these places that are now set out under subsidiary legislation like Tetron, etc., is the Minister of Homeland Security. That in itself scares this country. So when the Minister of Homeland Security is presented with the information for detention order, the first thing somebody wonders now is it most or is it mostly? Is it most or is it mostly? But that is what is determining. That is what is determining if somebody is going to be detained. So it is all up to one individual in law, the Honorable Member for Tunapuna, to issue a detention order. And when it is issued and executed, all of your rights under the Constitution are suspended. And what the member for Barataria Sawa had the gall to come and say is, hey, don't worry, there's a tribunal set up. A tribunal which in accordance with the law is set up of 3 members by the Chief Justice. And we've had some hiccups with that, not as a result of the Chief Justice, but with some membership having to be changed, even though we warned about certain members. It has been brought to my attention in a legal capacity how this tribunal is functioning. I can only speak to one circumstance. See, the way the tribunal is set up, the person who is held, the detainee, can call for a hearing if he or she believes their rights are being affected, they're not being treated well, etc. The Honorable Minister of Homeland Security must pass that on to the tribunal. The tribunal must set a hearing. And there are very, very clear regulations, and there's an order that has been gazetted, procedural guidelines as to how the review will take place. Once the review is completed, assuming it is completed, a report is then produced. But now for the country to know how this tribunal has operated, there is a specific instance and circumstance where someone who is detained had called for, their attorneys had written for asking for a tribunal hearing. Tribunal date was set, the date was vacated. Tribunal date was set, the detainee, the person under the detention order, whose family had no clue what was going on with him, was not brought to the tribunal. It was then set up that it would be virtual. We're not in a COVID period. Okay, so maybe national security. When the tribunal eventually sat this safeguard measure and heard the submissions of attorneys and of the detainee, they are duty-bound in law to produce a report. And the only person who gets that report is the Minister of Homeland Security, the member for Tunapuna. It says in law, according to the guidelines and according to the regulations, that they make recommendations, and those recommendations are to be passed to the detainee. In this particular circumstance and instance, finally having gotten a tribunal hearing, finally having had it proceed, radio silence. Radio silence. Right to the tribunal, no response. Tribunal shirking under the law and saying, well, not even sure whether the report has been sent, although in law, there's a timeline for that to be sent. Assume that the report was sent. You then hear nothing from the minister. What is that person, a live example of a citizen, supposed to say now, under the state of emergency and the safeguards that we're being told exist? Because you can't go to court. You can't go for habeas corpus to bring the person. And it is being alleged by the person's family that they're suffering all sorts of ailments. The purpose of habeas corpus is the court intervening to ask that that particular individual be brought to the court for the court to assess and for the family and others to assess. There's a suspension of those rights. So, Mr. Speaker, the short points are, in accordance with the Constitution that was very, very carefully crafted, for a last resort like a state of emergency, where our fundamental and entrenched constitutional rights are suspended. For example, the right to bail, the right to free movement. Why is it under the regulations? Because they like to pride themselves on saying they don't cut and paste. Regulation 11. Why does this still exist? Because it does not conform with what we're being told is the reason for the state of emergency. Regulation 11 is statements prejudicial to public order. No person shall, A, endeavor whether orally or otherwise to influence public opinion in a manner likely to be prejudicial to public safety, or B, do any act or have any article in his possession with a view to making or facilitating the making of any such endeavor. Any lawyer trying to interpret that will know how broad it is. So orally, and in this day and age of social media, a citizen who is frustrated, who wants a vent, and calls for people, for example, as was happening, come down to Woodford Square and let the government know that you don't agree with the state of emergency, or you don't want people to know what is, you agree with what is going on with the unfortunate geopolitical situation we have found ourselves smack bam in the middle of. The legal advice to that has to be, hey, careful you fall into an offense under the state of emergency and Section 11. Because it is easy for that to be interpreted that you're influencing public opinion in a manner likely to be prejudicial to public safety. It cannot be convenience because it is our rights being suspended. The same thing, Independence Day was cancelled for security reasons, we were told. Fireworks cut down for security reasons, we were told. Being the people that we are, trusting government and security services as we do, we accepted it. But only to see at that point in time a number of public officials, including government ministers, some of who we were told under threat, down at the Brian Lara Academy in the middle of CPL in a security nightmare. In a security nightmare. The same thing, I came here 2 or 3 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, like every single member, to listen to the first budget presentation by the member for Faizabad. In the middle of a state of emergency, you know, but because it's the government, they're large and they're in charge. And we're being told about threats to government officials, repeated here this afternoon. And I was shocked. Came in not too far behind the member for Tabakit. And I was shocked to see the hundreds of people gathered in the same type of uniform or outfit, because it's the same color. And then worse than that, to see the Honorable Prime Minister, the member for Siparia, alight from her vehicle and swarming around her. If there is a security risk and we're in a state of emergency, how come it doesn't apply for there? Because I can tell the security experts that that has to be a nightmare to keep a principal secure in those circumstances. Because everybody in front of you in the hundreds is dressed the same way. But what we have failed to hear here this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, is the reason for the extension. It does not conform. What we've been told so far does not conform with Section 8 of the Constitution. There's no imminence of war that we've been informed of, thank God. We are not in a state of a pandemic or earthquake or hurricane or flood or fire, thank God. So it could only be that there is something that is immediately threatened. Coming here to say, I need more time to carry out operations I'm in the middle of, after having admitted to the country that the first time we came here in July, there was a specific threat, and that has been quelled. So the immediacy is gone. What is the extension for? And I am cautioning Trinidad and Tobago, as a member for Port of Spain, North St. Anne's West, who has been elected, not as a person who is asked to come here. I am cautioning Trinidad and Tobago, as I did in July, we cannot get into a numbness and a desensitization of suspension of our constitutional rights. That is very dangerous. Thank you very much. We cannot allow, as a population, the suspension of our constitutional rights and not be told the truth in accordance with the Constitution of what is the immediate threat. Because you see, when you become numb, when you become desensitized, you will wake up one morning with states of emergency rolling. And the caution has to be, the government in this instance has a special majority that gives it certain constitutional powers. And we have seen how they use it and intend to use it. And there are those on the other side that have absolutely no problem in the way when they're carrying out their behavior, some of which ends up in the courts by saying, hey, we just doing what we want to do, you know. Who we want to move, we will move. Who we want to deal with, we will deal with. So Trinidad and Tobago, as we come here for the extension, because the opposition has shown it will be responsible. The opposition has shown it will listen intently, as we did in July, and we will support what needs to be supported to fight crime. But states of emergency are not designed to be a crime plan. They're not designed to give rights to fight crime. That is not what the conditions are. And we faced it in 10 years of governance. Because very often, people feel overwhelmed and they say, well, look, let us call a state of emergency and we will do X. The first question you ask is, why, in accordance with the existing law, you cannot carry out what you're supposed to carry out? So there was a threat in the prisons. We've been told that has been dealt with. What is it that is taking place now that requires an extension? How many charges have taken place? We haven't been told of a single one. And I know there are some charges that have taken place because we've asked the question. But how many under the anti-gang legislation? These gang leaders that were forming a criminal syndicate that was going to do so much destruction to Trinidad, and I believe it because we know how the criminals are, having sat on the National Security Council. What has been done? Have they been charged under the anti-gang legislation? Have they been charged with conspiracy to murder if they're putting out hits? Have they been charged with anything? Because when the state of emergency ends, what is the plan then? To leave it for a few days and then come back and start a new one? To try and use your constitutional majority to then extend it? Is that where we're going in Trinidad and Tobago? And no one on this side has said we are not supporting the police service and the defense force in their fight against crime and criminality. But a state of emergency is not the way to do it. That is a fact. And that is a good segue into this, Mr. Speaker. It is an article, not an article, a report written. The author is Sandra Pellegrini, senior analyst from Latin America and Caribbean from a body called ACLED that looks at human rights, looks at the effects of these states of emergency. And it is actually titled, dated the 24th of September of this year, so a few days ago. Do states of emergency in the Caribbean suppress gang violence or spread it? The cases of Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. And I don't have enough time to get into it, Mr. Speaker, but just to tell the population, find it and read it. Just do a search on the internet to see how states of emergency are really successful. Because the initial suppression, after it is desensitized, goes away. As we're seeing now, a perfect segue. Because I heard again statistics from the two previous speakers on the other side. Statistics for August, statistics for September, and the least amount of murders in August or September. What I didn't hear about was October, the month we've just come out of. And there's a reason for that, Mr. Speaker. If you would permit me, I am reading from the Daily Express editorial of the 17th of October, Friday, 17th of October, and it is titled, A Dark and Bloody October. And it says, by contrast, the character of this month is the same source that you all pay. By contrast, the character of this month because we will look at it and we will observe. I heard the speakers on this side talk about corruption, and I hear the Attorney General talking. The country is going to look on at the corruption cases before the courts, and it will be interesting to see what comes of those corruption cases. And I get back to the article. By contrast, the character of this month is a dark and ominous reality. Just over 2 weeks just over 2 weeks, in more than 28 murders have been recorded, disturbingly distributed against the country's geography. So in the first 2 weeks of October, this is what the press had to say, 28 murders. They go on to say a 7-day period was the bloodiest week of the year. This is October. This is October, Mr. Speaker. A 7-day period was the bloodiest week of the year, with 20 people murdered, including a triple murder in Friendship Village, San Fernando, a double murder of 2 brothers in Mount Hope, a deadly ambush and killing of a businessman in Chaguanas, and a double shooting at a bar in Valencia. That, Mr. Speaker, is the reality of what we're facing. So don't come here and say that the statistics of the state of emergency support a continuation, because that is not what a state of emergency is for. The framers of the Constitution didn't provide for a state of emergency to fight crime. It is for very specific instances, none of which we have heard here this afternoon. And one only needs to look at today's newspaper, the front of the Newsday. Guns kill 4 in 24 hours as MPs prepare to debate the state of emergency extension. 4 killed by guns in the last 24 hours as we are coming here, hopefully to hear a good reason for an extension, none of which we've heard so far. The back of the Express newspaper, Mall murdered, man gunned down after leaving Valpark nightclub. 4 men found dead in a state of emergency. A state of emergency, Mr. Speaker, is not a crime plan. A state of emergency should never be used to fight the criminality in the manner that is being suggested here. And the safeguards that we're being told are in place are not working. And every citizen needs to know that their rights are continuing to be suspended. And we have spent 6 months out of the year so far under states of emergency, so we expect crime statistics to be down. And you hear them on the other side, that is good. The answer is yes, we are happy, but not utilizing a state of emergency. There was a comment made that we could not bring a dinar into investments. I'll just respond briefly to that. The fact is that tens of billions of US dollars were invested, and those are what they are living off of in the energy sector now. Mento, SIP, all of those extensions. And I just remind the country, Mr. Speaker, I just remind the country what the mover of this motion said in his opening. The initial crisis was successfully dealt with. We have taken the time and we've shown constitutionally what must exist for an extension, none of which has been fulfilled. So, Mr. Speaker, we all know that the government will do what it wants because they are busy boasting all over that that is how they plan to operate. But Trinidad and Tobago, my closing words to you are remember today, remember the caution of today, and make sure that our rights are not continuously rolled over and suspended with states of emergency that are clearly the UNC's crime plan. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.